beneath the ancient oaks of St. Michael's Cemetery in Charleston, South Carolina, lie 9 graves that the city's most prominent families refuse to speak of. Each headstone marks the resting place of a wealthy plantation owner who died between 1851 and 1855, all under eerily similar circumstances. Sudden paralysis followed by what physicians of the era called a merciful death. But in 1923, during renovations at the cemetery, groundskeepers made a shocking discovery that officials immediately ordered sealed from public record. Inside each coffin, the wooden lids were scratched deeply by fingernails, and the bodies were positioned as if in desperate struggle. What authorities uncovered next would haunt Charleston's elite for generations. A leather journal buried beneath the oldest magnolia tree, written in the precise hand of Solomon Fairfax. It detailed 4 years of calculated revenge that began with a family's screams and ended with 9 men buried alive, before continuing the story of Solomon Fairfax and the dark secret that turned a healer into Charleston's most methodical killer. Join our community of truth seekers. Hit subscribe, ring the notification bell, and share in the comments which state you're listening from. The journal's first entry, dated March 15, 1851, opened with a line that explained everything. "Today I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing." In the 1850s, Charleston was the crown jewel of Southern aristocracy, with white-columned mansions along the Cooper River and fortunes built on rice and cotton that created untouchable dynasties. The city's small medical community commanded immense respect among the wealthy, who could afford private physicians for frequent mysterious ailments, fevers, sudden weakness, and paralytic conditions that seemed to strike the elite with alarming regularity. Dr. Cornelius Hathaway established his practice on Meeting Street in 1845, quickly earning a reputation among Charleston's upper class for innovative treatments and knowledge of exotic remedies. His success relied in part on his exceptional assistant, a slave named Solomon Fairfax, who possessed extraordinary knowledge of medicinal plants and chemical compounds. Solomon had been purchased specifically for Dr. Hathaway's practice after showing remarkable skills in botanical medicine, inherited from generations of healers in his family across the Carolina Low Country. Solomon Fairfax was no ordinary field slave. Tall, with keen, intelligent eyes, he had been educated alongside the children of his previous master, learning to read and write long before such education was forbidden. His command of Latin medical terms impressed Dr. Hathaway, who relied on Solomon to prepare complex compounds and assist in delicate procedures. Wealthy patients grew comfortable with his presence, often requesting him for his gentle bedside manner and intuitive understanding of their ailments. Yet Solomon's life had not always been confined to the sterile walls of a medical practice. For 32 years before joining Dr. Hathaway, he had lived on the Pemberton plantation, 15 miles outside Charleston, where he married Celia and raised 3 children in the plantation slave quarters. The Pembertons tolerated this arrangement because Solomon's healing skills were invaluable during frequent outbreaks of disease that could devastate the workforce overnight. His expertise saved countless lives, earning him respect unusual for someone in his position. He developed treatments for everything from snakebites to consumption, blending traditional African remedies passed down from his grandmother with techniques he learned from observing white physicians who occasionally visited the plantation. The Pembertons even allowed him to tend to their own family, demonstrating the trust placed in his abilities. This relative comfort ended abruptly in March 1851 when Edmund Pemberton's gambling debts forced him to sell portions of his human property. The sale included Solomon's wife and children, who were sent to different plantations across the state, a practice plantation owners justified as business necessity, but which shattered families. Solomon pleaded with Pemberton, offering to work additional years without pay if his family could stay together, even suggesting alternative arrangements to earn extra income. But Pemberton, under pressure from creditors demanding immediate payment, refused. The sale was scheduled for March 14, 1851, at the Charleston Slave Market, and nothing could change it. The morning of March 14 broke gray and humid, with storm clouds gathering over the Ashley River, as if nature itself sensed the tragedy about to unfold. Solomon had spent the previous night holding his family close in their small cabin, memorizing every detail of their faces, every sound of their breathing, knowing that sunrise would bring permanent separation. Celia, his wife of 15 years, remained composed, focusing all her energy on preparing their children for what lay ahead. 8-year-old Marcus, the eldest, had inherited Solomon's intelligence and curiosity about the world beyond the plantation. 6-year-old Samuel possessed his father's gentle nature and natural aptitude for healing, often helping Solomon gather medicinal plants from the woods around their quarters. Their daughter, 4-year-old Grace, clung to her mother, sensing that something terrible was coming, even though she could not fully comprehend the danger. When the slave traders arrived to collect their human cargo, Solomon watched helplessly as his family was loaded into a wagon alongside 6 other families, all being torn apart by Edmund Pettin's financial desperation. The children's tears mixed with their parents' promises that they would somehow reunite one day, promises meant only to ease unbearable pain. The true horror began during the journey to Charleston Slave Market. Halfway there, a wagon wheel struck a deep rut in the rain-soaked road, tipping the vehicle dangerously. In the chaos, Celia fell, hitting her head on a sharp roadside rock. Blood poured from the wound, and Solomon, despite his shackled hands, struggled to reach her. The slave traders, concerned only with delivering their cargo intact, made a decision that would haunt him forever. Instead of seeking medical help, they declared her a loss and ordered the wagon to continue without her. Solomon screamed and fought against his restraints, but the other slaves held him back, knowing resistance would only bring punishment for all. The nightmare continued at the Charleston Slave Market, where he watched helplessly as his children were sold separately. Marcus was purchased by a rice planter from Georgetown, tasked with dangerous work in alligator-infested swamps. Samuel went to a cotton farmer in the upcountry, notorious for driving slaves to death. Grace, too young for field labor, was sold as a house servant to a family in Savannah, vanishing into the vast network of human bondage that linked southern cities. Through it all, Solomon maintained a facade of resignation, aware that any display of emotion or defiance would worsen his situation. Inside, however, something vital had broken. The man who had devoted his life to healing now watched everything he loved destroyed by the casual cruelty of men who saw human beings as property. Dr. Hathaway, unaware of the full extent of Solomon's tragedy, purchased him for his medical skills, paying a premium for the healer's reputation. He had heard of Solomon's abilities from other physicians who witnessed his work at the Pemberton plantation and needed someone with advanced knowledge of medicinal compounds for his growing practice. As Solomon was led away from the market to begin his new life as Dr. Hathaway's assistant, he cast one final glance at the place where his family had been scattered. In that moment, something cold and calculating settled in his heart, a patience that would allow him to wait, learn, and eventually make those responsible pay. That evening, alone in the small room above Dr. Hathaway's practice that would serve as his quarters, Solomon began writing in a leather journal he had managed to hide. By candlelight, he penned the words that would define the next 4 years of his life. Today I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it. But I am still alive, and I remember every face, every name, every voice that laughed as my world ended. They think they have broken me, but they have only taught me patience. The following months at Dr. Hathaway's practice passed in a blur of routine procedures and careful observation. Solomon performed his duties with quiet competence, mixing compounds, preparing treatment rooms, and assisting with patient care. Yet beneath this facade, he conducted another study, learning the intimate details of Charleston's medical community and the wealthy families who formed Dr. Hathaway's clientele. Dr. Hathaway, a widower in his 50s with no children, relied heavily on Solomon's expertise. The doctor's arthritis made precise work increasingly difficult, and Solomon's steady hands and encyclopedic knowledge of medicinal preparations had become indispensable. Even more crucial for Solomon's plans, Dr. Hathaway allowed him to handle certain patient interactions independently, especially with chronic conditions that required regular monitoring. Charleston's elite, accustomed to the finest medical care, initially regarded Solomon with the mixture of casual indifference and condescending approval typical of their treatment of skilled slaves. However, Solomon's obvious skill and respectful demeanor gradually earned him a level of trust that would prove crucial to his plans. Patients began requesting him specifically, praising his gentle touch and apparent, intuitive understanding of their conditions. During this time, Solomon methodically researched the backgrounds of every wealthy family who visited the practice. He gathered information on their business dealings, social connections, and, most importantly, their involvement in the slave trade that had destroyed his own family. Through careful listening and discreet inquiries among other slaves who worked in Charleston's grand homes, he compiled detailed accounts of the men who had participated in or profited from the auction that scattered his children across the South. His investigation revealed that Edmund Peton was only one link in a much larger chain of exploitation. The Charleston slave market thrived with the support of the city's most respected citizens, men who served on church boards and charitable committees, while simultaneously treating human beings as property to be bought and sold. These were the men who dined elegantly, discussing literature and philosophy, all while their fortunes were built on the suffering of families like Solomon's. Among Dr. Hathaway's regular patients, Solomon identified 9 men directly connected to the destruction of his family. Some had attended the auction, bidding on human cargo with the same detached interest as if purchasing livestock. Others had financially backed the operation, lending money to dealers who specialized in breaking up families to maximize profit. A few had even purchased slaves from the auction that sold his children, further contributing to a system that treated human beings as disposable. As 1851 gave way to 1852, Solomon embarked on what he privately called his education in advanced chemistry. Dr. Hathaway's medical library contained numerous texts on pharmaceutical compounds, including detailed descriptions of substances capable of inducing paralysis, unconsciousness, or the appearance of death while leaving the mind fully aware. Though intended for legitimate medical purposes, these books became Solomon's textbooks in a curriculum of revenge. His most significant discovery came from a treatise on South American plant toxins, which described a compound derived from a vine native to the Amazon basin. The plant had been successfully cultivated in the greenhouse of a Charleston botanist who supplied exotic specimens to wealthy collectors. This particular toxin, when properly prepared, could induce complete muscular paralysis while preserving consciousness and the ability to feel pain. To any observer, the victim would appear dead, yet remain fully aware of their surroundings for hours before the effects became fatal. Solomon spent months learning to identify and cultivate the plant, eventually locating specimens in the greenhouse of Professor Nathaniel Crenshaw, a natural sciences teacher at the College of Charleston. Unaware of Solomon's true intentions, Crenshaw welcomed his help with the exotic collection. Through careful experimentation with laboratory mice, Solomon determined the precise dosage. Too little caused only temporary weakness, too much resulted in immediate death. But the correct amount produced a state indistinguishable from death to anyone without extensive medical knowledge, leaving the victim conscious long enough to experience the terror of being buried alive. Psychological preparation for his plan required even more discipline than mastering the chemistry. Solomon maintained his gentle, helpful demeanor while internally preparing to witness men suffer in ways that violated everything his healing nature had represented. He justified this transformation by regularly reviewing the names of his children in his journal, recalling their fate and the callous indifference of those who profited from their sale. By winter 1852, Solomon had identified his first target, Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick, a wealthy rice planter who had attended the auction and openly joked about the breeding potential of the children being sold. Fitzpatrick suffered from chronic gout and visited Dr. Hathaway's practice monthly for temporary relief. The Colonel's trust in Solomon, the regularity of his visits, and his habit of arriving alone made him an ideal first victim for Solomon's carefully planned campaign. Yet Solomon forced himself to wait, understanding that patience and perfect execution were essential to avoiding suspicion and ensuring justice for all 9 men. In his journal, he meticulously documented each target, noting their medical conditions, treatment schedules, and involvement in the slave trade. These entries resembled a physician's case notes, but detailed a very different treatment plan, one designed not to heal, but to make 9 men experience the helpless terror that his own children had felt. Thus, the transformation of Solomon Fairfax from healer to methodical killer began, forged through a year of meticulous preparation in 1852. Every detail had to be perfect, every contingency planned, every variable controlled. The men Solomon targeted were not isolated individuals but pillars of Charleston society, men whose deaths would be scrutinized by the city's most prominent physicians and investigated by authorities under immense pressure to find explanations. Solomon's first step was to establish himself as indispensable to Dr. Hathaway's practice. He arrived earlier each morning to prepare the office, stayed later each evening to organize medical supplies, and demonstrated such dedication that Dr. Hathaway increasingly relied on his judgment in medical matters. This growing trust would be crucial when Solomon needed to handle certain patients independently, without the doctor's supervision. Developing his paralytic compound required months of careful refinement. Working in a small shed behind Dr. Hathaway's office, ostensibly to prepare herbal remedies, Solomon cultivated the toxic vine and experimented with extraction methods. The process was dangerous. On several occasions, he accidentally exposed himself to small amounts of the toxin, experiencing temporary numbness that gave him a terrifying preview of what his victims would endure. The final compound was a colorless, odorless liquid that could be easily mixed with other medications without detection. Administered in the correct dosage, it took effect within 30 minutes, initially causing weakness and disorientation that could be attributed to the patient's existing condition. Within an hour, complete paralysis set in, yet the victim remained conscious, able to see, hear, and feel everything around them. The paralysis was so thorough that breathing and pulse could not be detected without extremely careful examination. To 1850s physicians, lacking modern diagnostic tools, a patient under Solomon's compound would appear to have died peacefully from natural causes. Only someone familiar with the toxin's properties could recognize the subtle signs of life. Solomon chose Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick as his first victim for both strategic and personal reasons. The colonel's monthly gout treatments provided a predictable schedule, and his arrogant demeanor made him easy to despise. He lived alone, except for house slaves who feared him, reducing the likelihood that anyone would insist on a thorough examination after his death. Fitzpatrick's medical history offered a perfect cover, suffering from gout and a weak heart that Dr. Hathaway monitored. His sudden death would appear natural. On December 15, 1852, Colonel Fitzpatrick arrived for his usual appointment, complaining of worsening gout. Dr. Hathaway, attending another patient, instructed Solomon to prepare Fitzpatrick's treatment and begin the consultation. This routine delegation provided the exact opportunity Solomon had been waiting for. As he prepared the medication, he added precisely measured drops of the paralytic compound. Years of medical practice had trained him to maintain steady hands and a calm expression, skills that now served him as he crossed the line from healer to killer. Fitzpatrick, accustomed to Solomon's care, consumed the treatment without question. As the toxin took hold and weakness began, Solomon sat beside the colonel, speaking in the same gentle, patient tone he had always used. "Colonel Fitzpatrick," Solomon said quietly, "my name is Solomon Fairfax, and you destroyed my family at the slave auction on March 14, 1851. You laughed when my children were sold. You joked about their value as breeding stock. Do you remember that day?" Fitzpatrick's eyes, already glazing over from paralysis, flickered with recognition and horror as he realized what was happening. He tried to call for help but found his voice gone, stolen along with his ability to move. Solomon continued, calm and precise. "You're not dying yet, Colonel. The medicine I gave you has paralyzed every muscle, but your mind is fully aware. You can hear every word, feel everything happening to you. In about an hour, Dr. Hathaway will examine you and pronounce you dead from heart failure. Your body will be prepared for burial, and tomorrow evening, you will be placed in your coffin and buried in St. Michael's Cemetery." Leaning closer, Solomon ensured Fitzpatrick could see his face clearly. "But you won't actually die until several hours after you're buried. You will remain conscious as the dirt, is shoveled onto your coffin. You will hear every sound, feel every sensation, and have plenty of time to think about what you did to my children. That is when you will understand what true terror feels like. The paralysis was now complete. Fitzpatrick appeared lifeless, yet Solomon could see the desperate awareness in his eyes, the frantic effort to communicate or escape his immobilized body. Checking the colonel's pulse and breathing with professional thoroughness, Solomon confirmed that both were so faint as to be undetectable, without specialized instruments. 5 minutes later, Dr. Hathaway entered the treatment room and found Solomon standing respectfully beside what appeared to be Colonel Fitzpatrick's body, his expression appropriately concerned and somber. "I'm afraid the colonel has passed, Doctor," Solomon reported quietly. "His heart gave out while I was preparing his next treatment. He seemed to go very peacefully." Dr. Hathaway's examination confirmed Solomon's report. The colonel showed no signs of life, and given his known heart condition, the cause of death seemed obvious. Within an hour, the body was transported to Fitzpatrick's mansion, where arrangements were made for a funeral befitting one of Charleston's most prominent citizens. Solomon attended the service, standing respectfully in the section designated for slaves, as Colonel Fitzpatrick's coffin was lowered into the ground. As the first shovelfuls of dirt struck the wooden lid, Solomon wondered if Fitzpatrick was still conscious, aware of the burial. The thought brought him no satisfaction, only a cold, calculated sense of justice. That evening, he made the second entry in his journal. "Colonel Fitzpatrick has paid for his crimes. 8 more remain. Justice is patient, but it is certain." The months following Fitzpatrick's burial passed agonizingly slowly as Solomon watched for any signs of suspicion. Charleston's social circles buzzed with the expected condolences and tributes to the colonel's contributions, yet no questions arose about the circumstances of his death. Dr. Hathaway cited the case to colleagues as an example of how quickly heart failure could claim even seemingly healthy men, and Solomon's reputation as a skilled, caring assistant remained untarnished. The successful execution of his first revenge bolstered Solomon's confidence to proceed with the second phase of his plan, but it also forced him to confront the psychological toll of his actions. Despite years of preparation and certainty in the justice of his cause, witnessing a man die in terror affected him more than anticipated. For weeks, he could not sleep, not from guilt, but from imagining what Fitzpatrick had endured during those final hours, buried alive. Selecting his second victim required careful consideration of timing and method. Solomon needed to avoid establishing any pattern that might attract attention, varying both the intervals between deaths and the apparent causes. His research identified Judge Marcus Calverton as the ideal next target. Calverton had not only witnessed the sale of Solomon's family, but had provided legal justification for separating enslaved families, arguing that such practices were essential for maintaining order and maximizing economic efficiency. The judge suffered from severe migraines, which had worsened over the past 2 years, necessitating increasingly frequent visits to Dr. Hathaway. This provided Solomon with both opportunity and cover. Fatal strokes occasionally struck migraine sufferers, and the judge's advanced age made such an outcome medically plausible. But an unexpected complication nearly derailed Solomon's campaign. In March 1853, Hathaway announced he was considering taking on a junior partner, Dr. Timothy Henderson, a young physician recently trained in Philadelphia, eager to establish himself in Charleston's competitive medical community. Henderson's addition would mean increased scrutiny of Solomon's activities, more witnesses to his patient interactions, and greater difficulty administering his paralytic compound undetected. Even more concerning, Dr. Henderson had trained under physicians familiar with the latest forensic advances, including methods to detect unusual substances in deceased patients. Solomon realized he would need to accelerate his timeline. Rather than spacing his victims' deaths over years as planned, he would have to complete his mission within months, before Henderson's presence made it impossible to continue. This compression of his schedule required taking greater risks and accepting less than perfect conditions for some murders. The pressure led to his first serious mistake. While preparing Judge Calverton's treatment in April 1853, Solomon accidentally administered a slightly higher dose of the paralytic compound than intended. The judge's apparent death occurred faster than expected, and the intensity of the paralysis was so complete that even Dr. Hathaway noticed something unusual about the body. "Strange," Dr. Hathaway murmured. Dr. Hathaway murmured as he examined Judge Calverton's body. "The muscle rigidity seems more pronounced than typical for stroke victims. And look at his eyes. There's something almost desperate about their expression." Solomon's heart raced as he watched the doctor conduct a far more thorough examination than he had performed on Colonel Fitzpatrick. For several terrifying minutes, he feared that his entire plan might be exposed. Yet Dr. Hathaway's training, while rigorous for its time, lacked the knowledge necessary to recognize the effects of Solomon's exotic toxin. After 15 minutes, the doctor concluded that the unusual symptoms were simply the result of a particularly severe stroke. Poor man must have suffered terribly in his final moments. Dr. Hathaway observed, unknowingly describing exactly what Judge Calverton was enduring, paralyzed but fully conscious as his body was prepared for burial. Calverton's funeral drew an even larger gathering than Colonel Fitzpatrick's, befitting a man who had served Charleston's legal community for over 30 years. Solomon watched from the section designated for slaves as the coffin was lowered into St. Michael's Cemetery, just 3 rows away from Fitzpatrick's resting place. As the ceremony concluded, Solomon noticed something that sent a chill down his spine: a young man near the back, carefully recording notes in a small leather book. The observer was Thomas Grimby, a journalist for the Charleston Mercury, who had begun investigating what he termed the prominent deaths phenomenon, a string of sudden fatalities among the city's elite that, while individually plausible, appeared suspicious in aggregate. Grimby had observed that over the past 6 months, several wealthy citizens had died unexpectedly under medically explainable, but collectively questionable circumstances. That evening, Solomon's journal reflected his growing unease. Judge Calverton has joined Colonel Fitzpatrick in experiencing true justice. But I fear others are beginning to notice patterns that could threaten the completion of my mission. I must work faster, even if it means accepting greater risks. The accelerated timeline meant his third victim would need to be eliminated within weeks rather than months. He selected Captain William Dandridge, a ship owner who had transported slaves from Charleston to markets throughout the South, personally supervising the loading of human cargo with the same precision he applied to valuable cotton shipments. Dandridge presented unique challenges. Unlike the previous victims, who regularly visited Dr. Hathaway for chronic conditions, Dandridge was generally healthy, seeking medical care only for minor injuries sustained at sea. Solomon would have to create an opportunity rather than waiting for one to arise. Naturally, through his network of contacts among Charleston's slave community, Solomon learned that Dandridge planned a dinner party for prominent members of the city's shipping community on May 20, 1853. The event would provide the perfect opportunity to eliminate his third target while observing multiple potential victims. Kitchen slaves, often borrowed from different households for large events, shared information about their master's plans. Solomon, having established friendships with several of these slaves, arranged to assist in serving the dinner, gaining direct access to Dandridge and his guests. Meanwhile, Thomas Grimby continued his investigation into Charleston's string of prominent deaths. The journalist frequently visited St. Michael's Cemetery, noting burial locations and documenting medical histories. Grimby's discoveries would soon pose a serious threat to everything Solomon had carefully orchestrated. The evening of May 20, 1853 marked the beginning of the end of Solomon Fairfax's methodical campaign of revenge. The dinner at Captain Dandridge's mansion on East Bay Street brought together 12 of Charleston's most influential shipping merchants, offering Solomon an unprecedented opportunity to study multiple potential victims while targeting his primary one. Solomon's involvement was arranged through Martha, an elderly slave overseeing kitchen operations for many of Charleston's grand social events. Unaware of Solomon's true intentions, she welcomed his help, as several of her regular assistants had fallen ill during a fever spreading through the slave quarters of the French Quarter. The captain's dining room gleamed with crystal and silver as Charleston's maritime elite gathered to discuss the expansion of shipping routes and the increasing profitability of human cargo transport. Solomon moved through the room with practiced invisibility, refilling wine glasses and clearing plates, while listening to conversations that exposed the casual brutality beneath Charleston's prosperity. Captain Dandridge, a robust man in his early 50s, with graying hair and weathered hands shaped by decades at sea, presided at the head of the table. He entertained his guests with stories of profitable voyages and strategies for maximizing the value of slave shipments. His detailed descriptions of preventing rebellions during transport and keeping human cargo alive on long journeys made him especially contemptible in Solomon's eyes. As the evening wore on, Solomon identified several other men whose involvement in the slave trade marked them as future targets. The conversations he overheard revealed a network of complicity far broader than the traders directly involved in his family's sale. These men discussed human beings with the same detached interest they gave to cotton prices and shipping schedules, viewing the destruction of families as a tolerable cost of doing business. Solomon's opportunity came with the serving of the final course, an elaborate dessert prepared individually for each guest. Working in Captain Dandridge's kitchen, Solomon carefully added his paralytic compound to the captain's portion of brandy-soaked cake, using a method perfected through months of experimentation. The toxin blended seamlessly into the alcohol-soaked dessert, masking any taste while ensuring rapid absorption. Captain Dandridge ate with obvious enjoyment, praising Martha for the dessert and requesting the recipe for his own cook. Within 30 minutes, he began to feel the initial effects, mild dizziness, which he attributed to the wine and the heat of the crowded dining room. As the paralysis progressed, he excused himself, claiming he needed fresh air. From the kitchen doorway, Solomon watched as the captain entered his private study and collapsed into his leather chair, just as the toxin reached full potency. The discovery of Captain Dandridge's death 20 minutes later created precisely the chaos Solomon had hoped to avoid. Instead of dying quietly under controlled conditions, the captain had expired in the presence of 12 witnesses who immediately demanded answers. Dr. Samuel Pettigrew, one of the guests, examined the body as the others looked on in growing alarm. "This is most peculiar," Pettigrew announced. "Captain Dandridge appears to have suffered some kind of seizure, yet there are no clear signs of apoplexy or heart failure. The muscle rigidity is pronounced, almost as if he had been poisoned." The word poisoned sent a jolt through the room and triggered exactly the scrutiny Solomon feared. Within an hour, 2 additional physicians were summoned. By morning, news of the suspicious death had spread through Charleston's social circles. Thomas Grimby, the journalist tracking the string of prominent deaths, arrived at the mansion before dawn. He interviewed servants and guests while memories were still fresh. His investigation revealed that Solomon had been present at the dinner, marking the first time a single individual could be connected to multiple deaths among Charleston's elite. The net was closing. Yet Solomon's mission was unfinished. 6 of his intended victims remained alive, and the growing attention made it unlikely he could eliminate them using his established methods. Desperation, and the knowledge that time was running out, drove him to the most dangerous decision of his campaign. He would attempt to kill multiple targets at once, using a method designed to inspire maximum terror, even if it meant almost certain capture. Solomon's research revealed a private meeting scheduled for June 15, 1853, when 6 of Charleston's most powerful slave traders would gather at the offices of Henderson and Associates to finalize contracts for a major expansion of their operations. The meeting was to be held after business hours, providing an opportunity to trap all 6 men in a confined space. The plan he devised was both ingenious and horrifying in its simplicity. Over 2 weeks of nighttime work, Solomon used his access to medical supplies to prepare a large quantity of his paralytic compound in highly concentrated form. Rather than administering it individually, he planned to introduce the toxin into the building's gas lighting system. Henderson and Associates used a central gas line, feeding lamps throughout the building. By injecting the compound into the main supply, Solomon could ensure that everyone inside would be exposed within minutes of the lamps being lit. On the night of June 15, Solomon positioned himself in the alley behind the Henderson and Associates building, waiting for the 6 men to arrive. At exactly 8 o'clock, the office windows glowed with gaslight, signaling that the meeting had begun and that Solomon's trap had been set in motion. Within 30 minutes, the building fell silent. Solomon waited another hour to ensure the paralysis had fully taken effect before slipping inside through a rear entrance he had accessed with a duplicate key, obtained through careful planning. The main conference room that greeted him was both horrifying and satisfying. 6 men sat frozen around the mahogany table, locked in the exact positions they had been in when the toxin struck. Their eyes, the only part of them still capable of movement, tracked Solomon as he moved, revealing the trapped awareness and terror within their immobilized bodies. He approached each man individually, speaking in the same calm, professional tone he had used with previous victims. He identified himself and explained, with clinical precision, what was happening to them, that they would remain conscious through their burial and the suffocating hours to follow. The panic, disbelief, and desperate attempts to communicate reflected in their eyes gave Solomon a grim satisfaction he had not anticipated. Even after years of meticulous planning, his moment of triumph was abruptly interrupted. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside the conference room. Someone was in the building who shouldn't have been. The door opened to reveal Thomas Grimby, the journalist who had been investigating Charleston's string of suspicious elite deaths. Grimby had followed leads to tonight's meeting, arriving just in time to witness Solomon standing over 6 seemingly lifeless bodies. "So it's true," Grimby murmured, his voice a mix of horror and vindication. "Someone has been systematically murdering Charleston's elite, and you're responsible." Solomon realized his careful plans had unraveled completely. There was no plausible explanation for his presence, nor for the conveniently timed deaths of 6 men, all his targets. Grimby's investigation had led him to the same inescapable conclusion. Charleston authorities would soon reach someone with medical knowledge and detailed insight into the victims' schedules had been carrying out a methodical campaign of murder. "They destroyed my family," Solomon said calmly, making no attempt to deny his actions. "They sold my children like cattle and left my wife to die by the roadside. This is justice, not murder." Grimby's response reflected the complexity of Charleston society. As a journalist, he was committed to exposing the truth, yet as a Southerner, he understood the brutal realities of the slave system that had motivated Solomon's revenge. This internal conflict created a tense pause, determining both men's fates. "Those men in there," Grimby said, gesturing to the paralyzed victims. "They're still alive, aren't they? Their eyes. You've done something that makes them appear dead while keeping them conscious." Solomon nodded. "They'll experience exactly what my children felt when torn from everything they knew. They'll have hours to contemplate what they did, just as my family did during that wagon ride to the market." Their conversation would later be recorded in Grimby's journal, discovered decades afterward. The journalist was caught between his duty to report a mass murderer and his human understanding of the injustice that created him. "I can't let you continue," Grimby said finally, "but I also can't ignore why. Those men profited from breaking up families, selling children. In a just society, they'd face consequences." Solomon's reply revealed the philosophy sustaining him through 4 years of planning. "In a just society, my family would never have been destroyed. Justice was denied to us, so I created my own, guided by the knowledge their system provided." Their standoff was broken by approaching voices outside. Investigators were arriving, drawn by expectation or suspicion. Both men realized the scene would soon be discovered, and Solomon's fate sealed. "There's a back stairway," Grimby whispered. "You could still escape. I could delay reporting, give you a head start to the countryside." But Solomon had accepted the inevitable. 9 men had destroyed his family. He had killed 6. The remaining 3 would survive to profit from the system that created the crime. "I'm not running," he said with calm certainty. "Let them come. Let them see. Maybe then people will understand that even slaves have limits." Outside, voices grew louder, accompanied by multiple footsteps ascending the front stairs. Grimby made a choice that would trouble him for the rest of his life. He decided to protect his story, rather than Solomon. Positioning himself as an observer, the journalist documented what followed, ensuring he could deliver a complete account of Solomon's capture and the discovery of his victims. When Charleston's city constables burst into the conference room, they encountered a scene that defied immediate understanding. 6 prominent citizens sat motionless around the table, appearing dead yet displaying none of the usual signs of natural death. Standing calmly beside them was a slave who neither fled nor resisted arrest. Instead, he offered a full confession, along with a detailed explanation of his actions. Solomon's confession, recorded by the chief constable and preserved in Charleston's criminal archives, provided answers not only to the deaths of that night, but also to the mysterious fatalities that had confounded the city's medical community for nearly 2 years. The paralytic compound, its method of administration, and the deliberate selection of victims, based on their roles in the slave trade, were all documented with the same methodical precision that had defined Solomon's campaign of revenge. The trial of Solomon Fairfax became one of the most controversial legal proceedings in Charleston's antebellum history, not because his guilt was in doubt, but because of the moral questions it raised about slavery, justice, and the limits of human endurance. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Charles Routledge, framed the case as a straightforward matter of murder. A slave had killed 9 prominent citizens and must be executed to preserve social order. The court-appointed defense, led by the reluctant attorney Benjamin Crawford, faced the nearly impossible task of representing a client who had confessed to multiple murders while arguing that those acts were driven by the systematic destruction of his family. Crawford did not attempt to deny Solomon's guilt. Instead, he focused on exposing the brutal realities of the slave system that had produced such desperate revenge. The trial brought to light details of Charleston's slave trade that had long remained hidden. Testimony describing the forced separation of families, the casual cruelty of slave auctions, and the total legal powerlessness of enslaved people forced society to confront an institution it preferred to view as benevolent. Solomon's account of witnessing his family's destruction, while being powerless to intervene, compelled Charleston's elite to face the human cost of their economic system. Thomas Grimby's coverage of the trial for the Charleston Mercury created a sensation throughout the South. His articles, which included extensive excerpts from Solomon's journal and detailed explanations of the paralytic compound, were reprinted in newspapers from Virginia to Louisiana. The story of a slave who had transformed medical knowledge into an instrument of revenge became a source of fear and fascination among slaveholders across the region. The medical aspects of Solomon's crimes drew particular attention from the scientific community. Dr. Hathaway, devastated by the revelation that his trusted assistant had used the practice as a base for murder, testified in detail about Solomon's pharmaceutical expertise and access to exotic compounds. The discovery that an enslaved man possessed advanced knowledge of chemistry and toxicology challenged prevailing assumptions about intellectual capacity and sparked debate over the education of slaves. The most powerful testimony came from the 6 men paralyzed in the Henderson and Associates building. All survived, though the horror of their experiences varied based on how long each remained conscious after being declared dead. Their accounts of lying fully aware while unable to move, hearing their deaths pronounced and funeral arrangements discussed, provided a visceral understanding of Solomon's revenge beyond any legal argument. Colonel Harrison Vance, one of the survivors, described the psychological torment he endured. He testified that he could hear and feel everything, but could not move even an eyelid. When his wife wept over his body, he longed to comfort her, to let her know he was alive. Instead, he remained trapped inside his own body, while preparations were made for his burial. He concluded that if Solomon had intended to demonstrate terror, he had succeeded completely. The revelation that 3 earlier victims, Colonel Fitzpatrick, Judge Calverton, and Captain Dandridge, had been buried alive sparked outrage far beyond Charleston. Families across the South began questioning whether their own relatives had truly died of natural causes. Demands for exhumations and post-mortem examinations overwhelmed the city's medical community, creating a climate of suspicion that endured for years. Throughout the proceedings, Solomon remained calm and articulate. He expressed no remorse for his actions, voicing regret only that he had been unable to complete his mission against all 9 of his intended victims. Solomon's final statement to the court offered a chilling summation of his motivations and methods. "I was trained to preserve life and ease suffering. Yet when this society destroyed my family under the guise of law and propriety, I learned that the same knowledge used to heal could also be used to deliver justice. I do not ask for mercy, for none was shown to my wife and children. I ask only that, when you condemn me, you remember, I am not the one who created the system that made this revenge necessary." The jury deliberated less than an hour. Solomon Fairfax was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death by hanging, a verdict unsurprising given the scale of his crimes and the perceived need to maintain order in a slaveholding society. Yet even with the swift conviction, the moral questions his case raised about slavery, justice, and the humanity of enslaved people remained unresolved. On October 15, 1853, Solomon was executed before a crowd of over 2,000 spectators, all gathered to witness Charleston's most notorious criminal meet his end. His final words, spoken with the same calm certainty he had displayed throughout the trial, were recorded by Thomas Grimby and widely published. "I die knowing 9 men felt the terror my children endured when they were torn from all they loved. That knowledge makes my death worthwhile. But this system, which breeds such desperation, will continue. Other families will suffer as mine did. Remember that even the most patient person has limits to what they will endure in silence." Solomon's body was interred in an unmarked grave outside Charleston city limits, in accordance with laws prohibiting the burial of executed criminals in consecrated ground. His journal, confiscated as evidence, never returned to authorities after the trial. Grimby, who had examined it during coverage, made extensive copies before returning the original to the court clerk. Years later, preparing his memoirs, Grimby chose to bury Solomon's journal beneath a magnolia tree in St. Michael's Cemetery, near the graves of the men Solomon had killed. He explained his decision in 1889. "I could not destroy the record of such methodical revenge, yet I could not allow it to inspire others. Perhaps future generations, with a different perspective on justice and slavery, will better understand the terrible necessity that drove Solomon Fairfax to become both healer and killer." The journal's discovery in 1923, during cemetery renovations, revealed scratch marks inside 9 coffins, confirming the truth of Grimby's account. The victims had struggled in their coffins, trapped in the paralytic compound Solomon had devised. Charleston's city government immediately classified the findings as sensitive, setting concerns about public safety and racial tensions, though many believed the true motive was to protect the reputations of families tied to the slave trade. The legacy of Solomon Fairfax extended far beyond Charleston. Across the antebellum South, slave owners grew wary of educated slaves, particularly those with medical knowledge or access to pharmaceuticals. Laws were tightened, restricting access to books, scientific training, and medical instruction, recognizing that education could empower the oppressed into formidable adversaries. Solomon's case also spurred advances in forensic medicine. The exotic paralytic he had used prompted research into detecting unusual toxins, improving post-mortem examination techniques that would aid future criminal investigations. Perhaps most profoundly, the story challenged the very assumptions underpinning slavery. If a trusted, educated slave like Solomon could enact such methodical revenge, what did that imply about the unspoken resentment harbored by millions across the South? Solomon Fairfax's story reminds us that justice delayed is not always justice denied. It may simply take a darker, more terrible form. Even in the bleakest chapters of history, individual acts of resistance could shake the foundations of seemingly invincible systems. What do you think? Were Solomon's actions justified by the destruction of his family, or did his revenge become another form of evil? Share your thoughts below. If you want more explorations of the hidden, uncomfortable truths of American history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this story with someone who appreciates the complexity beneath our nation's official narratives. Remember, the past is never truly buried. It waits for those brave enough to uncover it.